My name is Emily, and I'm going to be talking to y'all about protecting pollinators from pesticides in New Mexico. So here's a quick outline of my talk. We're going to start by talking about the amazing pollinators of the Southwest and their importance. This will give us the foundation for my next topic, pesticides and their impacts on pollinators. And then I'll give you some quick tips about how to avoid pesticides in your home gardens. And my last topic is integrated pest management in cities. So the Los Alamos County has come out with a draft IPM plan, and Kristen asked that I cover some elements of the plan in my talk, so we're going to do that. Before I dive into those topics, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. So here's a little bit of information about me. I came to the Xerces Society from graduate school at the University of Virginia, where I was studying pesticides on agricultural land, as well as their impacts on butterflies. So the picture at the bottom left here shows my painted lady butterfly caterpillars that I reared on a diet mixed with pesticides to understand the impact of the pesticide on their development. And the adult painted lady butterflies look like that picture in the top left. I'm so excited to be working with the Xerces Society now, and I'm bringing all that experience and knowledge from my thesis with me. If you aren't familiar with the Xerces Society, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. Our name honors the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly, which was a butterfly species found only in sand dune habitats of the San Francisco Bay Area. Destruction of those dunes led to the extinction of the species. And in honoring that name, we dedicate ourselves to science-based work to protect other invertebrates with programs focused on pollinator conservation, endangered species conservation, and reducing pesticide use and impacts. I also want to take a quick second to thank our supporters. We're especially thankful to the Carol Petrie Foundation and the many Xerces members that make our work here in New Mexico possible. So here at Xerces, a lot of our work is dedicated to insects like butterflies, bees, and fireflies, but also other invertebrates, which are animals without a spine or a backbone, such as snails and freshwater mussels. So invertebrates make up 94% of all animal species on Earth and play crucial roles for the function of our planet, including pollination, seed dispersal, decomposition, and they are food sources for many wildlife species. Pollination is a particularly important ecosystem service. Pollination is when pollen from one flower is transferred to the stigma of another flower, where it combines with the ovary to create a seed. And this is how plants reproduce. While some plants rely on wind for pollen transfer, more than 85% of flowering plants require an animal to move their pollen. Pollinators are also critical to the production of our food as humans. They are essential to 35% of crop production globally, helping farmers produce the food that we eat. Our diets would be much less nutritious and less diverse without those bees and other pollinators. So these pollen-moving creatures include some vertebrates, like hummingbirds and even bats, but the vast majority are insects and invertebrates, like bees and butterflies. So there are insects that you probably already know are pollinators. I just said bees and butterflies, but there are other groups that may not immediately come to mind. So we've also got moths and beetles and wasps and flies. And all of these insects visit flowers to feed on nectar and sometimes collect pollen. And they pick up this pollen serendipitously when they visit these flowers. But bees intentionally collect this pollen to feed their young, so they more actively collect that pollen and distribute it. Of all these kinds of insect pollinators, bees are the most efficient and the most important pollinators. Part of the reason why is that bees are built to collect pollen to feed their young. So they have these hairs that allow them to carry way more pollen than those other pollinators. So I've got this picture here of a green sweat bee, and it's got those hairs on its legs that allow it to really pack in that yellow pollen. Bees also exhibit flower constancy. So this means that once a bee is familiar with collecting pollen from a plant species, they'll continue to visit that flower species consecutively on that foraging trip. So this will help guarantee that the pollen from one flower will make it to the flower of the same species and help those plants reproduce. And bees also forage or collect food resources in areas around their nest. A plant would be visited several times by the same bee, pollinating more of its flowers and guaranteeing seed set. An important distinction to make is that honeybees are not your typical bee. They're an introduced species and they're not native to the US. You probably already know that they're social bees. This means they have a queen and everyone works together for the success of the hive. They're also perennial. This means that they are active all year long and a hive can live for multiple years. This is a big reason that they were domesticated. Their pollination service is important for a lot of crops, and hives are shipped all around the country to keep up with that demand for pollination. Honeybees are experiencing colony collapse disorder and disease, but because honeybees are domesticated, there are still more hives than there have ever been before. So honeybees are not a threat of extinction. Actually, honeybees can compete with our native pollinators. So when we talk about bee conservation, we're actually talking about the many native bees that live very different lives compared to honeybees. And native bees are very diverse. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors. There are about 3,600 species in the US, with about a quarter of those found in New Mexico. So bumblebees have similar social behavior to honeybees and work together as a whole colony. But bumblebees are a really small percentage of bee species, when about 90% of bees are actually solitary. So this means that each female will find a nest, collect all the food for their offspring, and lay eggs without the support of a colony. Native bees are also really unique in that many of them are specialists. This means that they collect food from only a small group of plants. For example, some bees are cactus specialists. This means that they'll only collect pollen from cactus flowers. So bumblebees and honeybees are generalists that visit just about any flower that has pollen, but many of those solitary bees are specialists. Native bees also live and nest differently from the honeybees. The leftmost picture here is of a bumblebee colony. Bumblebees are social cavity nesters, with several bees helping to raise the young in these clusters of wax pots. In the US, 1% of native bees are bumblebees with this type of nest. In the top right, we have a solitary tunnel nesting bee. Around 30% of native bees make their nests in tunnels or hollow stems in a series of brood cells. And the bottom right bee here is a solitary ground nesting bee. So the vast majority of bees actually dig into the ground for their nests. And this is especially true of species found in the desert. So I don't have enough time to talk too thoroughly about native bees and their amazing lifestyles, but if you want to learn more, I'd recommend checking out Caitlin Hosse's Xerces talks on YouTube. So I wanted to show you this map. It's really cool. It shows species richness in North America and South America. The yellow means that there aren't very many bee species there, and the dark red to black means that there are lots of different bee species there. So you can see that the southwestern US holds a really amazing diversity of bees. In fact, in just one national monument, more than 660 species were found. It is unknown why bees are so diverse in arid regions, but it might have to do with better ground nesting conditions or stronger relationships between the specialist bees and their plants. We don't really know, but no matter the reason, it's evident that there is so much worth protecting in the Southwest. Unfortunately, many bees, pollinators, and other invertebrates are in decline. So this study I'm showing you collected data from several community science data sets and found that 80% of the most widespread butterflies in the West are in decline. The red line here indicates a stable population trend, whereas the black diamond for each species listed indicates the average population change. You'll notice that the black diamond is to the left of the red line for all of these species. And this means that all the species listed here are in decline. Included in that list are the American lady butterfly, Vanessa annabella, which is the bottom butterfly picture here. And the Western population of the monarch butterfly is also listed. And it's not just butterflies that are in decline. Research is documenting declines in all kinds of pollinators and other invertebrates. So a global review of over 70 studies found that 4 factors are likely to be primary drivers of insect declines: habitat loss, climate change, diseases and invasives, and pesticides and pollution. Pesticides were the most commonly cited in all these studies, so I'm going to talk about the threat of pesticides in this next part of the talk. So we're going to start with what are pests and pesticides. A pest is any unwanted living thing. And remember that pest is context dependent. So an ant in your garden that's aerating the soil may not be a pest, while ants in your house might be. A pesticide is any substance used to control or get rid of that pest. The word pesticide is also an umbrella term. So this means that a pesticide can be an insecticide that targets insects. It can be an herbicide that targets plants. It could be a fungicide that targets fungi. All of these examples here are different pesticides. And pesticides have been around for centuries, tied in particular to agriculture, but they all used to be organic or chemicals that could be found in nature. So here's some examples. We've got the Sumerians in 2500 BCE, and they used sulfur. There were some more mineral-based pesticides that were used. And then there were, with the ancient Greeks and Romans, salt water, crayfish, leek juice, all of these things that they found could deter pests. And then in the 1800s, we got up to using Paris green, which is copper arsenite, which doesn't sound like a great thing to have on your food. However, after World War II, modern chemicals started being incorporated into agriculture and public safety. Synthetic pesticides are developed in a lab and cannot be found in nature. So DDT is an example of a synthetic pesticide. It was broadly applied in the 1960s because it was effective at killing mosquitoes. Y'all are probably already familiar with the declines in bald eagles that resulted from the widespread use of DDT. So Rachel Carson, pictured here, also the author of Silent Spring, brought attention to these unseen effects of DDT on the environment. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was founded in the 70s in response to Carson's work, as well as other industrial pollution issues. And since then, EPA has been housing regulation and registration of pesticides. The EPA eventually banned the use of DDT. And while this was a big victory, it's not as simple as getting rid of one chemical. More synthetic pesticides were eventually developed, and pesticide usage continued to rise with new risks to the environment. And we call this the pesticide treadmill. So nowadays, there are a lot of living things that people want to control. So there are lots of pests to treat them. I have some facts here. So there are over 900 active ingredients of pesticides in the US. And active ingredients are the main chemical that's killing the pest. And there are even more inert ingredients that are not disclosed at all on the pesticide product packaging. And these ingredients help the pesticide do its job. So an example of this is a pesticide that needs to stick to a seed, might have something that'll help it stick, and that would be an inert ingredient. So there are over 20,000 formulations of pesticides in the US, and we use 1 billion pounds of active ingredient per year. This is really concerning, especially because active ingredients are usually a really small percentage of what's in the pesticide. And finally, residential applications make up for about 25% of insecticide use. So this is something that we can all work on to reduce that use. So we use a lot of pesticides, and part of the reason why is that we believe they are essential. The pesticide paradigm is the unspoken and almost unconscious assumption by industry, state, and the public that chemical pesticides are absolutely necessary, safe, and effective. I hope that I can help break this assumption as I show you in these next few slides, because I don't think any of those adjectives, necessary, safe, and effective, are wholly true. So this is an example of how pesticides only address symptoms of deeper problems. In agriculture, the Colorado potato beetle has developed resistance to just about every pesticide farmers have tried to control it. The beetle defoliates potato plants and can prevent the plant from producing potatoes at all. So pest resistance starts with pesticide application. The Colorado potato beetle, like many pests, reproduces quickly and has many offspring. This is part of the reason that they're a pest, but it's also a big part of the reason they can develop resistance. So in a huge brood, it's more likely that there is an offspring with a mutation in the genetic code that allows them to survive the pesticide. When the population is diminished by those chemicals, those offspring that survive reproduce, and that mutation becomes a population-wide trait. And more of the beetles will survive each treatment with each generation. Over time, we've applied more and more pesticides to this beetle, and it has now evolved resistance to 52 different compounds, and it's considered a superbug. Also, pesticides can do more harm than good by killing the natural enemies of pests. So this is the convergent lady beetle. They're a predator that eats lots of aphids that might be bothering your plants. There are also parasites and parasitoids like the stachinid fly that can control pest populations as well. But if you apply pesticides that harm those natural enemies, they won't be able to control the pests for you anymore. It's devastating that pesticides are applied to kill one or a few pests when 98% of insects are not pests and are an important part of the ecosystem. So I found this pretty surprising that less than 0.1% of pesticides actually reach their target pest. So what happens to the remaining 99.9? So pesticides do not stay in the location that you apply them. Pesticides can travel by wind. This is called drift. They can travel by water or even by soil erosion. And when they do, they end up in places that we really don't want them. Pretty much everywhere that we've looked, we've found pesticides. In pollinator plants like milkweeds, in honeybee hives and in their food, in soils where they can harm important soil invertebrates, and also in streams and rivers where they can harm aquatic invertebrates. And I want to note that that study found that 90% of tested rivers had pesticides that could be dangerous to aquatic life. So, and pesticides have even been found in the Arctic. So pesticides are absolutely everywhere, but let's talk more about how pollinators can be exposed to all these pesticides in the environment. So there are a few ways that they can be exposed: via direct contact, indirect contact, and with oral ingestion. So my first box here on the left shows direct contact in which the pollinator is being directly sprayed. And then we'll move to the middle box in this slide. This one shows indirect contact. And this means that the pollinator isn't being directly sprayed, but the resources that it needs to survive are being coated in pesticides. So when it goes to collect those resources, it will make that contact with them and have exposure. Similarly, just to the bottom left of that, there are other materials that you might not think of immediately that a pollinator needs, but if they're coated in those pesticides, can also lead to an indirect contact exposure. So in this picture, we've got a leafcutter bee that's taking a little chunk of leaf with it back to its nest. And if that plant is coated with pesticides, that leaf piece is going to be a source of contact exposure for the bee. As well as under contaminated nest sites, we've got a bee that is building a nest underground. Like we said, most of our bees build nests underground. But if the ground has pesticides on it, that means that it will be a contact exposure for that bee that's digging in the dirt. And finally, some pesticides are systemic. So this means that when a pesticide is taken up by a plant with water, the pesticide will be spread to all of its tissues. This can lead to oral ingestion when a pollinator visits that plant to eat the pollen and nectar from it, or if there's a caterpillar that's eating the leaves of that plant that also have the pesticide in it. So these pathways show some examples, but I want to note that not all pesticides are applied as sprays. There are also soil drenches and seed coatings and trunk injections for trees. There's a whole lot of ways pesticides can be applied. And also, I want to note that the pollinator does not have to be present at the time of application to receive this exposure. Sometimes pesticides can last in the environment for months up to years. So a pollinator that's coming to visit a flower a year later might still get exposure if a pesticide was applied there. So when pollinators are exposed to pesticides, they might experience mortality or sublethal effects. So whether the pollinator dies can depend on a whole lot of things, including the pesticide, the concentration, the species of pollinator, the individual even, and environmental factors. Sublethal effects are effects of the pesticide that don't directly kill the insect or doesn't kill it immediately. So I listed a whole bunch of examples of sublethal effects from this review of sublethal effects of beneficial arthropods. So some of these here are impaired development, decreased immune function, decreased mobility, impaired navigation. So things like this can be a huge deal because if a bee is out there foraging and it's trying to find its way back to its nest, but it has that impaired navigation, it might not even be able to find its home. So those are some sublethal effects. But I also saw both mortality and sublethal effects in my thesis research that I wanted to share with you guys today. So my example of mortality is I've got in this top left picture, my caterpillars were not able to complete their whole chrysalis. So you can see in this image that it's got kind of a half chrysalis going on, but the rest of its body is still a caterpillar. All of them that were in that state died like that. And I have this picture in the bottom left too. This one looks like a more normal butterfly, but this painted lady was actually an adult with a much smaller body mass. It didn't weigh as much as the ones that weren't treated with a pesticide. And this can be a really big problem because these butterflies are migratory and they have to have fat stores to be able to make it through that whole migration. So this butterfly might actually starve on trying to do its migration because it doesn't have a big enough body weight. So sublethal effects can be just as impactful as mortality itself. And I want to remind you that it's not just insecticides that are dangerous for pollinators. Fungicides are generally classified as practically non-toxic to pollinators on their labeling. But various studies have shown that they have subtle yet harmful impacts on bees. In apple orchards, fungicides reduced wild bee abundance, which is awful. Another study found that fungicides were the most abundant pesticide in honeybee hives, and that they caused issues resembling malnutrition. And this includes reduced brood rearing, queen loss, and increased pathogen levels. What's worse is that fungicides are often applied with insecticides. This is especially concerning because some fungicides and insecticides have synergistic effects. So this means that in combination, the chemicals are more harmful to the pollinators than their effects added together. So the system that we currently have accepts and expects harm from pesticides to pollinators, other invertebrates, and to people too. Part of the reason is that science cannot completely predict the impacts of synthetic chemicals on natural systems. And regulation by the EPA has been built on uncertainty of harm. We cannot afford to make these risky bets when it comes to the invertebrates that maintain ecosystem function and the pollinators that guarantee our food supply. So the precautionary principle is just common sense, that we should err on the side of caution when the impacts of pesticide use could be damaging, widespread, irreversible, and incompletely understood. So in this next section of the talk, I want to give you guys some ideas of how you can reduce your pesticide use at home. So at Xerces, we promote preventative pest management strategies. This means that we can take action to prevent pests from becoming an issue so that we don't need to use pesticides. So one example here, plants have preferences for their environment. Some like drier soils, some like wetter soils, some like more sun, some like less. Putting your plants in environments that they like can help them be less stressed and less susceptible to pests. So an example here, this flower is bee balm or Monarda fistulosa, and it's very susceptible to powdery mildew. But if you put it in areas with more airflow, it will reduce the mildew. So remember, right plant, right place. So even if you never spray pesticides in your backyard, pesticides can still sneak in. So here's some things to watch out for. One way that pesticides can sneak into your yard is if you call a tree doctor for a sick tree. Trees are often anchors in home yards, but it's important to know that trees can hold pesticides for an extremely long time after an application. A recent study by a pesticide manufacturer found blooms and leaves could be contaminated with toxic levels of neonicotinoids the following year. If your tree flowers and has pollinator visitors, this could be an exposure route. We suggest considering, is this tree happy and healthy in my yard? Is this just one pesticide application, or are more going to follow? It's important to step back and balance your tree care with pesticide risk. Also, the perimeter or foundation of your home might be treated with pesticides. So I've got a little story. We conducted a milkweed sampling study a little bit ago, and at one home where pesticides had not been applied in at least 6 years, the milkweed was contaminated with concerning levels of an insecticide commonly used to manage structural pests. We found out that right before the current owner moved in 6 years ago, the home had been treated for ants or termites. Shortly after moving in, they planted the milkweed in the treated area, and that soil has been a source of insecticide exposure ever since. So, pollinator attractive plants around the exterior of houses may be a source of exposure if those homes were treated for structural pests. And lastly, be careful where you buy your plants. Nurseries often use pesticides on their plants. Plants that are even labeled bee-friendly can still have pesticides in them. The soil that your plant comes in might be contaminated, so we suggest maybe dumping as much of that soil as you can so that the plant doesn't continue to take up more pesticides from it. We also recommend netting the plants in the first year that you have them to prevent pollinators from coming and reaching those materials that might have pesticides in them. So when looking to adopt new plants, look for organic plants and seeds and soil. You want to avoid plants grown with neonicotinoids, a class of pesticides, and other systemics. And you can ask your nursery what steps they take to offer plants grown that are pollinator friendly. Your nursery may not know a whole lot about pesticide use, and that's okay. But these questions are to help get nurseries to start thinking about how these plants are produced. So we've worked with Santa Ana and Plants of the Southwest in Santa Fe, and both are excellent examples of nurseries reducing or eliminating their pesticide use. And you can check out our website for some more resources about Be Safe plants. So there's a lot that we can do at home to provide habitat for pollinators and reduce pesticide use. This is super important work because urban areas frequently exceed rural areas in diversity and abundance of bees. And small habitat patches have disproportionately high value for conservation. Cities have a lot of urban area that workers landscape and care for, including roadsides, public parks, and around city buildings. These areas also have a lot of opportunity for pollinators if managed correctly, which includes limiting pesticide use. So I have an example here of a city. This was in Wilsonville, Oregon, that was providing habitat for pollinators with these big flowering trees. However, those linden trees were treated with neonicotinoids, and the bees sipping on the nectar of those flowers died in mass. 50,000 bumblebees, among other pollinators, were killed by visiting these trees laced with pesticides. So it's important to remember that scary incidents like this can bring attention to the problem of habitat contamination. But just as scary is the reality that pesticides are everywhere in smaller concentrations, mixing with other chemicals and causing unnoticed but pervasive harm to pollinators. So, a great way for cities to protect pollinators from pesticides is to create an integrated pest management plan. So, what is an integrated pest management plan? I'll tell you. So, broadly, IPM is about conserving habitats, species, and processes that sustain life, biodiversity, and us people. A good IPM plan employs strategies to manage pests that are safe to beneficial organisms and to people, is sustainable economically, and is durable over time. It's tricky to balance all those things. But Xerces believes that IPM can be broken down into 3 categories that together we like to think of as the 3-legged stool. The first leg is preventing pests by addressing the root causes of pest problems, using non-chemical strategies to alleviate that pest pressure. The second leg is assessing pest pressure by monitoring populations and evaluating system health. This also includes setting thresholds for different kinds of action when dealing with a pest. The last leg of the stool is limiting harm. This means that pesticides should be the last resort because of the harm that they do to non-target organisms. This also means that when using pesticides, you can apply them in ways that limit harm to other living things. So we're going to dive deeper into all 3 of these categories. The Bee City USA program has been spreading awareness and implementation of integrated pest management all across the country. So all the dots that you see on this map are certified bee cities and bee campuses. And in New Mexico, Albuquerque and Santa Fe are both bee cities. Santa Fe Community College is a bee campus, and I've heard rumors about Los Alamos becoming a bee city soon. All right. And all the bee cities are working on reducing pesticides by updating and improving their integrated pest management plans. So I'd now like to walk you through some aspects of the Los Alamos County draft IPM plan through the lens of the 3-legged stool. So keep in mind that I'll refer to the Los Alamos County as LAC, and I will refer to this draft plan as the IPM plan. So the LAC IPM plan talks about prevention measures such as testing the soil, analyzing the site conditions, creating plant species assessments, and planting with diversity. So a lot of these ideas are similar to the right plant, right place idea that we talked about earlier. Plants are less stressed when they are in environments that they like. So learning about the environment, like the soil type, and choosing plants that will like these conditions is a way to prevent pests. LAC also mentions planting with diversity, and this is a great idea because diverse plants attract a diverse insect community, and the greater the diversity, the more balanced the pests will be with their natural predators on the landscape. And these concepts all fall under that first leg of the 3-legged stool, preventing pests. LAC also mentions mechanical, cultural, and biological management strategies in their plan. Mechanical management strategies require more labor, but have little to no impact on non-target organisms when done correctly. Some examples are hand pulling weeds, clipping weed flower buds before they bloom and disperse seeds, and hand removal of insect pests. And some examples of cultural management are mulching and weed barriers. And lastly, biological management uses natural enemies of pests to reduce pest populations and prevent them from exceeding thresholds. But this strategy must be used extra carefully. In my picture here, for example, we've got lady beetles are commonly used to reduce aphid populations. And you can see that this yucca plant is covered in yellow aphids that the lady beetles are eating. So all these tactics that we talked about also fall under that first leg of the stool, preventing pests. There was a section in the LAC IPM plan to discuss thresholds. So a strong IPM plan will set thresholds for each pest. And if that threshold is breached, the city staff will enact some kind of treatment. So this is a really good strategy because it guards against unthoughtful use of pesticides. So you can reduce your labor by not taking action when the pest is tolerable. I also appreciated that LAC mentioned prioritizing areas that are important to the public and allowing more weeds in less trafficked areas. This means that they can free up some of their time to use less toxic strategies in those higher priority areas. So I wanted to share some examples with you all directly from the plan. So here's the plan's thresholds for golf courses. And this says that they'll tolerate 0 to 5% fungal pest pressure, 0% grassy weed pressure, and 0% insect pest pressure. These thresholds are extremely low and mean that city staff will have to focus their time here to maintain these standards so that visitors can have a pristine golfing experience. This part also mentions an annual preventative treatment. So many golf courses have similar plans to this, but there are also some golf courses that have prioritized using less chemically intensive management techniques. So it could be valuable to learn more about Los Alamos' golf course issues and see if changes can be made to make this large green space more pollinator friendly. LAC also details thresholds for public parks. All parks have 100% tolerance of fungal, weedy, and insect pests. So this means that they will not apply pesticides in public parks where kids could be exposed. They have these same thresholds for dog parks as well, protecting our animal companions from pesticide exposure. And pollinators will be better supported at these parks where pesticides are not in use. So the county could add or enhance their habitat there to take advantage of these safe green spaces. So I don't have time to go through every single part of the LAC IPM plan, but here's a breakdown of some things that were mentioned and some things that weren't mentioned that make a strong IPM plan. And keep in mind that not mentioned doesn't mean that LAC isn't doing these things. They could be doing a lot of them just without it being in the draft plan yet. So my first one here is that the plan is being written, and this is a super exciting step because a lot of cities and campuses have pest management plans that never really get on paper or are missing a lot of information. But something that they could improve is that they don't talk about the plan being regularly reviewed and updated, and that's a strong element of an IPM plan. The plan also talks about posting pesticide application info on the county website. This is really great, and they could also take it a step further by posting signage at the site where the pesticide was applied and setting re-entry times to let people know when it's safe to enter again. And they might already have a public inquiry process, but the plan could mention that too. So LAC is on the right track with monitoring and setting thresholds for pests. They actually talk about Siberian elm, an invasive tree that they treat with triclopyr, a broadleaf herbicide. They could add some more information about other pests that they treat for, like the ones that they're treating for in the golf courses. So LAC didn't talk very much about the work that went into putting together this draft plan. I'm sure they had many stakeholders come together to discuss pest issues and treatments, but they could hire an IPM coordinator if they haven't already, and that person could be mentioned in the IPM plan as well as those stakeholders and community involvement. And my last point here, LAC is proud to share that they maintain pesticide-free zones in several parks. So those parks are West Park, Urban Park, Pinion Park, and Rover Park. I don't know if those are familiar to you guys, but super exciting. Those other parks are mainly pesticide-free, like we were talking about before, but they can have pesticides applied if there are noxious weeds or if there are too many goat heads, those really sharp things that you step on in the grass. But in general, LAC uses pesticides as a last resort, which is a huge win. And LAC also banned glyphosate, a probable human carcinogen. But they didn't mention the criteria upon which they banned glyphosate and what their screening process might look like for other pesticides. So the plan also talked about using triclopyr to control Siberian elm. Invasive trees are extremely difficult to manage, and while triclopyr is an herbicide with observed impacts on butterfly development and aquatic life, LAC is applying it with spot treatments. So this means that they use a really conservative amount of pesticide applied on a small area of the tree to prevent it from dominating the landscape. LAC could mention this strategy as well as others to reflect on reducing their pesticide exposure to pollinators and other invertebrates. So I want to focus just a little bit more on pollinators in particular, and LAC could talk more about pollinators and reducing their exposure too. Extension and other ag resources exist to help with this, but a few examples that I had in mind to limit harm to pollinators include LAC could talk about avoiding pesticide applications during bloom time, avoiding open dirt where ground nesting bees, like these squash bees, might be nesting, avoiding spraying butterfly host plants. So in Santa Fe, I've been seeing horsetail milkweed growing all over the place along the roadsides. If those roadsides are being sprayed for cosmetic or visibility reasons, caterpillars that are eating those horsetail milkweed plants might get exposed that way. But a really great suggestion is to use those spot applications because they will help with all three of those. Also, in talking with Albuquerque Solid Waste, who manages roadsides, I learned that they use spray nozzles that increase the droplet side of the herbicide to avoid drift. They also keep an eye on wind conditions to avoid drift, and they calibrate their equipment regularly. All of these strategies reduce the chances of spray getting on pollinators, on their food resources, and their nesting substrates. So those are all my thoughts on the draft IPM plan. I want to give a huge thank you to the Los Alamos County for documenting and working on this IPM plan. They're already doing so many great things to support pollinator and invertebrate conservation, and we're really excited to see how this plan continues to grow. I'm also super excited about Los Alamos' potential to be a bee city. So let me know if there are ways that I can support y'all in that effort. And if you like this talk, and want to support more of Xerces' work, consider becoming a member and donating. And you can follow this link to do so, xerces.org/donate. So thank you all so much for listening to my talk, and thank you so much to Peak for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Emily. Great job. So now's an opportunity. If anyone has any questions over Zoom, please type your questions into the chat, or if anyone in the auditorium has a question. Okay. So we have a couple coming through on Zoom. This is from Patty. How can you find out the best native flowers for your region? Or this says my region. How can I find out?
Great. So you can, do I need to repeat the question or?
No,
okay?
I just, yeah.
Great. Yeah. So hi, you can check out the Xerces website. We set it up so that there's different regions and you can click on which region you're in, and there will be plant lists there that will detail all of the best native plants. So you can check out those resources, or if you're in New Mexico specifically, we have a list that's catered specifically towards Albuquerque and Santa Fe, which is a super helpful plant list as well.
You mentioned, this is an aside to that, or an addition, you mentioned that plants, like specific areas, are better for specific plants. Are those sort of planting guidelines on those resources on your website as well, or where would one go about finding out about that?
Fantastic. So in case that wasn't caught on microphone, those suggestions were Master Naturalist has good lists, and Master Gardeners, and then the Native Plant Society also has a lot of good lists, and they're national, so they should have listened. The North American Native Plant Society.
Thank you. Perfect. So we'll give it a second longer to see if anyone else online has a question. Oh, do you want
So
to?
we have
Okay.
a question from the audience of how easy is it to be a Bee City USA? Well, I'll talk to you a little bit about when I was at the University of Virginia, I got them certified as a bee campus. And there are a few things that you have to do, but it's pretty simple. You basically talk to a whole bunch of people that care about pollinators or are interested in them. You get them together and you apply to become a Bee City. And once you do that, you're signing up to try to improve habitat in your city and create more habitat. You're signing up to reduce your pesticide use, as well as hosting educational events to tell your community more about how great pollinators are and what we should be doing to conserve them. Yeah, am I missing anything, Caleb? Yeah, so you host those events. There's an annual application, and yeah.
A lot of stuff that seems Los Alamos is already doing. So hey, here we are. So we did have a question that came in, which is, what can the EPA do better? How can they do better?
This is a very big question. Yeah, it's really tricky because it's about the way that the system was structured. But in general, EPA is doing its best to understand the pesticides, do what research they can, but they have really limited time and funding. Yeah, so I think that there are more things that could be done to improve our registration process and improve our list of banning pesticides, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done there because there just isn't complete understanding about so many of these pesticides that are for sale. So yeah, more understanding is needed about them to make a better decision of whether we should be using them or not.
It's a question in the audience.
Yeah, so we had a really great question comment from the audience about pests at home gardens, and that you really don't need to reach for a pesticide as soon as you see a pest. You can often use just like spraying with water to get rid of a lot of those pests, and there are a lot of natural remedies too. But I would check out the Xerces organic pesticides document. That is a lot of great ideas of if you want to use those more natural pesticides to try to get rid of pests, if just spraying with water isn't working, that can give you a better idea of like who might be impacted by those chemicals and how you can avoid exposure to the invertebrates that we want to protect.
Awesome. Thank you for that. It looks like we have no more questions from the online audience. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here with us this evening. Thank you, Emily, for sharing your knowledge. You're a fantastic public speaker. Keep it up. And thank you, everyone that tuned in this evening.